All right, we'll get started today on March 25th, 2019, and I'll convene the special meeting of the Board of Commissioners and recognize Michelle Lancaster, our Deputy County Manager, to introduce items for today's meeting.
Thank you very much, Chairman Helms. We will get started. Today I'll start by telling you that we're not asking the board to take any action on any of the items today. These are budgetary impact items that we really just want to share with the board before we ask for any formal action around some of these items. And we'll get started with our first item, the FY 2019 financial update. There's actually two components to this update. First, Jeff Yates is going to cover our year-end expenses and revenues and our initial projection for fund balance. And then following Jeff for this item, Blake Hart will provide the board with an FY 20 budget update, giving you details about where we are in our budget planning, projected revenues, expenses. I'll kind of preempt one of the things he's going to share is we still are working with a gap to close for building our FY 20 budget, and he will give you an overview of the steps that we're going through to work down to close that funding gap. But we will start with Jeff and our year-end projections.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. So you should have, I know we gave you a stack of paper. So we're looking at the document that has the title on 2019 year-end projections. If you remember back to starting last year, we started doing in the spring, started looking to our year-end and started trying to project out where we thought we were going to end the year. Blake talked a little bit about it in our initial budget work sessions this year. I think we talked a little bit about it in the January timeframe. So what we're working with right now is our data through the end of February, because that's our last completed month. That gives us about 5 or 6 months of revenue data for sales tax. It gives us almost 3/4 of a year on expenditures and other revenues. So it gives us a good place to start that forecasting period or that projections period. I'll tell you as we start out, this is going to tighten up as the months go on. So we'll take a look at it again in April because we won't have completed March numbers. We'll look at it again at the completion of April with in May with the completion of April. So as we get closer to the end of the year, it'll become more accurate. It's a little early at this point to nail it down exactly, but we feel pretty comfortable that we have an idea of where we're going for 2019. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk to you about today, is kind of give you that preview, talk in general terms, look at a few issues that are going on, a few trends, and those kinds of things. So we're going to look at revenues in total and expenditures in total, and then as Michelle mentioned, I'll give you a snapshot of where we are projecting fund balance to be. So let's jump right to it. General fund revenue, and of course we're talking about the general fund, meaning the fund where we pay for human services, sheriff's office, our administration. So just our main fund where that 20-cent tax rate, give or take, is attributed to most of our sales tax and so forth. So what we're seeing is our ad valorem is trending right on our revised budget estimates. Historically, what we could expect from this number, and that's across that top line right there, says ad valorem taxes and fees. Historically, what we would see in this revenue is a little bit more than anticipated. So we would normally have $1 million to $2 million more than budget. What we're seeing right now is our year-end projections only about 60,000 more, 63,000 more than what our budget is. So that has tightened up significantly. And we're spending about right on, or I'm sorry, we're collecting about right on where we've done it historically. So we feel pretty good about that. Our biggest collection period for ad valorem is past, meaning everybody pays, around the first of the year and so forth. Where we're seeing this then too is a tightening of the motor vehicle tax. So it's not growing as fast as it has in the past. Normally you could expect a little bit of month-over-month growth and so forth. So those are signs, in my mind, of kind of a slowing economic market. And where we also see this, that as we're talking about sales tax, is our local option sales tax. And you can see we have a revised budget of about $48.8 million, and we're thinking we're going to be right around 46.8. That's a factor of a couple of things. One of them is in the last few years, we've been fairly aggressive in our sales tax estimates. I think the board signaled to us that you would rather see us at the end of the year come real close from fund balance, adding fund balance or taking out fund balance at the end of the year, because being too conservative, for instance, maybe on estimates on our revenue. So we pushed that estimate up a little bit. But also, what I think we're seeing is a little bit of a slowing on the expenditure side. This is an indicator, of course, people buying goods and so forth. So we're not seeing as strong a growth in that area as we have in the past. I think it's important to note that With that, and part of this challenge is that you can go back to actual 2016, where we had about 70.7 million in ad valorem and about 34 million. That was a good split for the county at that time, more reliant on a stable revenue source with our ad valorem taxes and a little less exposed on the sales tax side. Well, now we're down to just a little bit more than half and half, 58.3 to 46.7 as a split. So the county, one of the challenges we face is that we've gone from a more stable revenue structure on ad valorem taxes to a more volatile revenue structure where we're relying more on sales taxes. So as we kind of see this number, and I'll steal a little bit of Blake's thunder, we're estimating, or at least we're right now holding our projection at our 2019 level, so we can grow into it. What we're seeing is a little bit of economic headwind that you kind of hearing that the Fed is talking about, that you're hearing from bankers. I'm sure, Frank, you've heard that a little bit too, is they're not changing the interest rates. The Fed, for instance, last week said there'll be no more interest rate increases because what they're seeing is a little bit of an economic headwind, meaning they're seeing the growth in the economy start to slow and temper a little bit over what it's been over the last couple of years. So all that to say is that we think that that's going to hold. We think we're going to grow into the 48 million, but not this year. So we're going to start, or we're going to end the year slightly under where we projected to be in 2019. And this is already taking into account our Christmas sales taxes. So we know we were a little over last year, but last year's growth still didn't come into where we thought it would be at that point. And then our charges for service, the other big category, it's performing a little bit ahead, and this is a number of issues, your permitting fees, this is any number of different kind of charges for service. So we're seeing good revenue growth in the county, and we're going to come in a little bit under, but remember we have about 10.6 million of fund balance budgeted, which is not a revenue, it's a forecast or a budget of current funds. So we're coming in about 162, a little bit behind what our projections would be. But that's okay because that's to be expected. When we look at the expenditure side of the equation, okay, because revenues ultimately have to balance, our revenues and expenditures go together to give you what your year in total will be. We see also that we're tracking just a little bit behind another in our expenditures as well. The personnel and benefit costs, right around 53.8 million. We projected it to be about 51.2 at the end of the year, which is fairly normal. That's normal attrition for the county. That's savings you get mostly from when positions change over. When people leave, you have a little bit of time lag between. There may be some money saved from people coming in at lower salary or higher salary and so forth. That's your normal turnover of your employees. Also remembering that part of the growth from 18 to 19 is the full-on implementation of our comp and class study and so forth. We're right where we thought we would be on employee benefits, which is a positive sign. Our operating costs are down a little bit. This is being driven largely, as you'll see in our budget slides, by changes in the way the state funds daycare funding. Before, that used to be a pass-through to the tune of about $4 million would come through the county to the agency providing the service. Now there's a direct relationship between the state and that agency providing the service. So where we saw a decrease in our intergovernmental state revenue, particularly right here, 7 million to 3 million, that's the revenue side of that equation, and you can see it plays out then also in our operating cost. So 4 million of that difference is related to that daycare services change. Does that make sense? So we'll update, when we do this again, we'll update the budget. I think there's a budget amendment coming to the management, which we have through our budget ordinance to actually go ahead and reduce that out of the budget, so it won't muddy up the comparison next time. You can see then our contracts and subsidies, we're tracking a little bit behind, but right on where we normally would be. And then our capital outlay, right now we're projecting to spend that all because we're assuming we'll buy the rest of our vehicles and the rest of the equipment this year. So in all, we're projecting to come in about 165.6, which is, if you look historically, is kind of right in line with what you would expect year over year. And when we do projections, when I do the projections, one of the things that's different is we kind of compare it to history, and I look back, and this is a statistical look. This isn't based on budget, based on what the departments are hoping to do. This is a mathematical calculation based on history. History being the best indicator of the future. So when we look at this, if this falls in line, if you're looking at across the bottom, for instance, you say, okay, 65.2 makes sense, 165.6. So that's the logic. You look for that linear path. So that's where we think we'll end up. So that total impact means a fund balance usage of about 3.6 million. So this is our projection, our 2020 fund balance projection. You probably remember this from last year. When we look at our general fund starting unassigned fund balance of about 12 million, we add back our reserve amount, 62.9. So in theory, our starting position for 2019 was about $75 million. Well, we think we're going to use about 3.6 this year in FY 2019. Our reserve amount, our estimated reserve at this point is about 64.2, just under 64.2. And that is last year's reserve plus 2%. We'll tighten that number up once we have a better budget number to work with. Remember, it's 20% of the schools, the county, the EMS, the fire fund, and the debt service fund. Okay? So we think we'll have, at the end of the day, get my dot back up there. There it is. About 7.2 million. We'll have our 2019 encumbrance roll, which is estimated about 1.5. It's on average 1.5 million. I think coming into this year, the 2018 roll was a little over 2 million, and that's programming and encumbrances. Our capital program, right now we haven't budgeted any fund balance usage plan for our capital program yet. And then we have about 950,000 currently, what we're determining as SL1, at our service level 1, in our initial projection on budget, about 950,000 of fund balance usage. And that fund balance usage is related to our economic development grants. When you give that grant to one of those economic development companies, or not economic development companies, but to one of those, when you give that grant for economic development purposes, the company that you give that to has to perform and pay their taxes and then put in a request. We have to verify it and so forth. So what this represents, the 950,000 represents the historical average of what we haven't had to pay out in that economic development grant program. So this is a one-for-one expenditure revenue number. So as that number goes, what this is saying is this is essentially the assumption that we don't want to take up current revenue with a contingent or a possibility of having to pay that. So we plugged it in as fund balance at this point, and if we have to pay it, we'll deal with that at that point. So when you take all these ins and outs, where we think we're going to end up is right around 4.8 million, and this is in June of 2020. So this is not this June, this is the following June. This will change because, again, this number is a plug at this point, it's an estimate. This number is based on actual expenditures. Our projections are based on actual. We haven't plugged anything in here for capital. And then we're going to talk a little bit later about a debt redemption that we'd like to do that'll take up about 3.4 million of this number at this point. So with that in mind, this is kind of our first snapshot of where we think fund balance is going to be at the end of 2020 and also at the end of 2019. Are there any questions on that? We'll tune this up, of course, with each time we come back to you.
That final fund balance estimate is after our required escrows that we use.
Right. So, and this would be only in the general fund.
Yeah, the 20%.
Right. So this would only be in the general fund as well. So this doesn't include the other funds that the county has. So we refer to this most of the time as a appropriable fund balance, meaning that you as the board can use it for any lawful purpose. Okay. So, and that's just a projection, and that number will move up and down. Now each time you see it, it'll go up and down based on the projections of these others, or the impact of these other numbers. Does that answer the question? I think the gentlemen that were here last year are familiar with this chart. We've seen this chart. This is our second year in using this type of chart. So, and of course, like I said, it'll all change. And then with year-end close, it won't be exactly this. So, kind of a couple of closing thoughts for you. We're still early in our year, so February is in quite 3 quarters. As we get closer, we'll be able to tune those up Our current estimates are being used as that tool in that budgetary process. So where we think we're going to end on revenue, for instance, is being used to base our next year revenue estimates on, and so forth. And then we're getting real close. We believe for budget purposes, we've locked in our ad valorem estimate. Van is still working on that with the new system with DevNet and so forth. So we don't have perfect knowledge on our ad valorem yet, but for our budgeting purposes, we pretty much locked down what our ad valorem estimate is going into next year. So with that, I'll be happy to take any questions that you have to follow up on that.
We are going to cover the relationship between the ad valorem projection and the local sales tax performance.
Blake is, I believe, in this presentation. So he's going to talk a little bit about that and the changes we know are coming on the line. Okay, so I think next up is Blake.
All right, thanks, Jeff. We're going to talk a little bit now about the FY 2020 budget process and give you an update on where we are. Jeff talked about where we think we'll be at the end of this year, and we're going to pick up where he left off at the end of FY 19 and what we're planning for FY 20 based on historical trends, based on projections through this year, and based on what we see for the next fiscal year. We're going to talk about the budget process that we're currently involved in. We'll begin with revenue, then expense, and we'll talk about the closing the gap strategies. Jeff mentioned we have a gap currently we're working to close. We'll do a quick process update and then talk about the next steps, so we're all up to speed on the budget process to this point. First, to start with revenues, Jeff talked about our revenues in general in FY19, and I just want to elaborate and update you a little bit on where we think we're going to be for FY20. Give you an idea, these columns, these are actual numbers through 17, 18. This is revised budget through 19 for the current year. This is what we're looking at for FY20. And this is the change column between FY20 planned budget and FY19 revised. So this is the difference between this number, and of course this is the percent change as we see there. If we go down here to the bottom, and I want to mention Jeff talked about fund balance a little bit and appropriate fund balance, and for the purposes of this slide to start the discussion, I pulled it out of the total number just so we can see the actual revenues and how they're growing. Jeff mentioned that fund balance isn't necessarily a true revenue in the sense of the word as how much new money is coming into the county, as much as it is an allocation of existing funds we have to use if needed during the course of the year. So if you look at just the true revenue, starting at ad valorem, local sales tax, and on down through here, we're expecting to see a 2.2% growth between FY19 revised and FY20 budget there, and that will give us an increase of about $3.6 million. So that's this number here, and again, that's excluding the fund balance, just natural organic growth of the tax base. Now that does include the estimate that we've been using for growth for planning purposes of a 3.6% increase to the value of a penny, or the value of our tax base. And that also includes, as Jeff mentioned earlier, holding sales tax flat. So those are our two major tax base options there. We're keeping sales tax flat at 19, and the question was asked about the sales tax allocation and how that correlates with our ad valorem rates. One of the things that we have done some analysis on to see how those numbers are interrelate. The sales tax distribution from the state, the amount that goes to the state and comes back to us, is dependent upon or is affected by the amount of ad valorem tax revenue that we receive in the prior year. So if this number here of ad valorem tax and fees, if it goes up, then we're going to receive a higher proportion of sales tax revenue available from the state to come back to us. If that number goes down, then the portion that we receive from the state through sales tax is going to go down proportionally. And that means the total amount coming into the county, and so the amount that's distributed, that's available for distribution among the towns, will also decrease based on that amount. And so what we've seen is that we believe that as our total intake has decreased over the past few years, that's affected the proportional amount of sales tax that we brought in also. And again, we expect that it'll impact us somewhat in FY20, starting on July 1, because our collections of ad valorem have been decreasing in the past couple of years. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And if Jeff has any comments on that, you're welcome to share those.
Sure. Just keep in mind that the allocation of sales tax is a two-step process. So the first step in the county, based on the ad valorem levy, is from the county as a whole between the towns and the county. So we've seen about a 1.5% to 2% reduction from 19 to 20, and that alone from our tax rate reduction. And then between the county's general fund and the fire districts, we're seeing also, because of that change, about a 2% reduction in that allocation to the county. So what we're dealing with is about a 3% reduction, 3.5% reduction in total sales tax revenue just from allocation changes. Before there's any economic pressure on sales tax, just due to tax rate changes, we're seeing that reduction in our sales tax.
I think that accounts for a portion of the gap there. Another portion of why we're holding it flat is because it was over budget a little bit in the previous year. So those two things put together are accounting for us holding it flat, because we feel like we can achieve it next year through the natural process. Commissioner?
Early in my orientation with y'all, I believe I asked y'all, how do we stack up sales tax wise with Mecklenburg, Cabarrus, percentage of what we're getting?
If you mean proportionally as to what percentage of our sales tax?
I mean, of what is our part versus what is Mecklenburg's part?
So they receive a much larger amount.
I'm not talking about gross dollars, I'm talking about percentages. Where I'm headed with this, Blake, I believe you told me that we did have some room left for capital education.
Oh, in terms of actual, like 7.25% versus all the articles that are available to the county to
I believe we
use.
still had some room left.
We have at least one available.
There's the one that's for transportation?
There's a quarter-cent, I believe, but we can get that for you. We don't allocate all possible sales tax articles here that are available to the board.
Through that discussion, I learned that the state, we had used up all we could do, but where I'm headed with this is we could move some burden from the real property owners to the sales tax. In other words, I believe my original discussion or question was, and what I remembered was we could fund some capital improvements for schools. There was some room left there.
Well, all the schools, the legally restricted funding for schools that comes through the sales tax, that capacity in that article, I think, has been all used. And right now, we use it, which is the other option. We use it to fund debt service. So all of our sales tax revenue, of that 48 million, a big chunk of that, 30 million-ish, 38 million-ish, somewhere in that neighborhood, I have to look it up, goes to fund schools-related debt, which is the other option you can use versus plowing it directly as cash funding into the school's capital. You can fund schools' debt with it.
And I'm not asking to give the schools more capital money.
Sure.
I'm asking to be able, if there's room, to bump the sales tax up some and the ad valorem rate down some.
Sure.
Yield the same money, but put more of a burden on the sales and get in line with Mecklenburg County. I think we're at 6 3/4 here, in Mecklenburg's at 7 1/4, 7 1/2.
They have a transportation tax that's not available to everybody. We can look at that. I mean, I want to, and Blake and Jeff we've talked about this quite a bit, this ad valorem and sales tax kind of proportion that we have. So I want to be clear, our sales tax really is not growing. It's not growing the way we would like to see it grow, and that's a combination of things. It's a combination of we were much more aggressive than perhaps we should have been and how we budgeted sales tax, but also this relationship between the 5-cent tax rate reduction, or 8 cents over the last several years, has a direct impact on how much sales tax we're able to bring in. It's not that people aren't paying the sales tax in the county, it's that we're not able to realize that because of the ad valorem distribution method that's used. I mean, we can look at it and tell you how much sales tax, we would estimate getting on a quarter of a penny, but it's not gonna grow at some huge amount. I mean, we're bringing in around 3.8 to 4 million a month in sales tax right now.
Yeah.
So Mecklenburg's bringing in probably $20 million a month in sales tax. So it's a very different conversation. Just their proportion is massive.
And I think if you look at too the sales tax, earlier we said that if our annual collections were to increase 1%, and that's about another $500,000.
Right.
And so to get $1 million, you have to increase your total collections by 2%. To get $1 million, 4% to get $2 million. So it's, that there's a limitation in the amount of growth based on the current structure we have. We're happy to look at it and see if there's an opportunity to
1%
grow.
being $500,000, that's not a full 1% increase on the sales tax.
Yeah, you're right.
Yes.
That's 1% overall.
Overall, right.
Overall, based on what we currently collect.
The other thing that I would be remiss, I think Jeff would want me to say this too, is that, I think it was in his slide, I mean, that sales tax is your most volatile revenue source. If the economy starts to tank, that is where we are gonna see the hit the quickest, and it's gonna be the hardest to come out of. So I just want you to keep that in mind, that particularly if you think about that as a replacement revenue source, it is not a stable revenue source, particularly if we think, based on all the economic indicators, that at some point, 2021, somewhere we might see a slowdown, that will be the first place we start to
I'm
feel
thinking of it
that.
more as a building the nest egg / fund balance back up from that 10 million that we did last year.
Yeah, one of the things that Michelle's talking about is as a proportion of total revenues, each year over the past 5 years, sales tax has become a bigger piece of our revenue puzzle, and it's a more elastic revenue source. So if there were to be a downturn or a dip in the economy, the ad valorem revenue source probably wouldn't take that big of a hit. But if sales tax dropped off in a significant degree, then that would impact us more, because it's a greater portion of our overall revenue table than it would be in other communities. And if you look at it, I had it in, before, but I didn't include it. But if you think of it, if each were 50% of 100% each year, then with each year it changes to be 52% ad valorem, 48% sales tax. No, I'm sorry, 48% ad valorem, 52% sales tax, 46% ad valorem, 54%. It's going in that method, and if we continue that trajectory, then we're going to be more vulnerable to a downturn in the economy, because that'll be a larger percent of our.
I'm not talking about basing spending on it or reducing ad valorem taxes. I'm talking about getting us back in a position where last year we were able to cut the tax rate and add to the 20% cushion.
Well, but your sales tax, the way it's calculated, is based on the ad valorem rate.
Yeah, they're
And
related.
so with what Michelle said a minute ago, with the 8 cent reduction in the ad valorem tax rate, it also reduced the amount of sales tax that actually is allocated back into the county. So last year, we saw a $1.8 million differential less.
I see what you're
And
saying.
so-
So we don't get all of the county rate that's collected.
No, it's based on a formula. There's four articles that go into the sales tax. And the biggest piece of the pie is based on your ad valorem tax rate. So, as in Jeff's slide earlier, he's showing, a revised FY 2019 at 48.7, which is showing there, but the projected is 46.7. It's $2 million less.
So going back, and I agree with Commissioner Simpson, we want people to spend money in Union County, but if they spend more money and pay more sales tax, but we lower the ad valorem rate, we could it'd be a net wash.
Yeah, we would get less back from the county. Yeah, there's a 1-to-1 correlate. Well, I'll say one-to-one as an example, correlation between if our ad valorem our ad valorem property tax revenue is lower, then the amount we're going to get back from the sales tax and redistribution from the state will be proportionally lower also. Yeah.
How do they justify taking money collected in Union County for the local part and not giving it back?
It's a calculation of leakage. So if people from Union County go shop in Mecklenburg County and then spend sales tax there, or they go shopping at the mall.
But you're talking about the state part, Blake, right?
Yeah,
I'm talking about the local part.
Well, it stays local.
yeah.
That allocation at the county
The
level.
local part stays local.
It does, because what we're talking about is the kind of the inter-county allocation methodology. So for instance, in that version where our tax levy starts to go down, and let's say Indian Trail, Monroe, Wingate, Marshville, their levies stay the same or grow, they're getting increased proportionally to that as well. And then the second allocation, which is within the county itself, is as the fire departments over the last few years, their tax rates have gone up as well. They're getting a greater share than also what we get. So all that revenue that's collected, the sales taxes in the county are staying within the county as in accordance with that allocation methodology for leakage. But how it's going between towns, the county, and the fire districts, that is a constantly changing methodology because of the tax rates and tax values of those different jurisdictions.
Mm-hmm. It's a two-step process. So if we reduce our tax rate again, then there would be less coming into the county, and then the distribution amongst, we would receive less as well in proportion to the other folks we share our tax rate with.
Well, I understand just enough to know I don't understand it.
We'll have
We
to
can
talk
show, I
to you
mean, we
more
can
about
show you, like, you can look and see where I think Monroe raised their taxes, we've decreased our taxes, their sales tax goes up, ours goes down.
it. Mhm.
I mean, you can see it, month to month as we get the reports.
And we did an analysis in the finance office to kind of pinpoint that and see what the net effect would be. And we have that, I'm sure we could share that with you in another discussion if you'd like. Great, good questions. Any other questions about revenue or any of the ideas for FY20? Okay, just one quick thing. So excluding the fund balance appropriation, we expect to see 2.2% growth in revenues. If you include that, $10.6 million that's included in the FY19 budget, if you include that, then it looks like there's about a 6% decrease in available funds, because that acts as kind of a revenue placeholder. So we are growing, but for this, since we haven't included that fund balance in excess of the economic development amount, we're showing a growth. But if we did show the change from this number, which if we add this, it'd be 173 million. So the change from 173 million to 167, where we are now, then that's about a 6% decrease in overall revenues. So I wanted to make sure that we understood that. All right, so now we're going to talk about expense. Overall, if you remember back to previous presentations about the budget process we're working through now, it's a target-based budget process. So we went through and looked at historical spending, looked at changes in departments and what their needs have been, and they were assigned a budget target to build towards. And as part of that target, they were asked to build a budget with a 2% reduction on total expenses. That includes salary benefits, which are the largest portion of everybody's budget anyway. So based on that, departments complied and were very cooperative in most cases to get to that. So if you look here, which is the total expense line, the decrease from FY19 and FY20 expected is about just over $2 million, which is a 1.2% decrease in total expenses between where we are in FY19 revised and what we're planning towards for FY20 budget. Now that takes into consideration and is offset by the increases to the salary and benefit line. Now the increases here are, let's see, together about $4.6 million, and it represents about a 5.4% increase in salary and benefits. So even though departments did, for the most part, did a great job of cooperating and building to that 2% reduction target, it's offset here by some growth in salary and benefits. which also includes 3% performance pool and some annualization of the class and compensation increases that were part of the FY19 budget. So those two things kind of put together are driving the increase to salary benefit expenses. Most of the decreases you'll see from departments pulling funds out of their budget to meet their target. You'll see here in the operating cost line, which is a decrease of 7% or $2.3 million, also in capital outlay and some contracts. So this is where the bulk of those reductions were taken within departments. And then we're very fortunate that we have a decrease in debt service this year within the general fund. Now we have another piece of the debt service, which is the school's debt service, which is separate. But this portion within the general fund is decreasing year over year. And Jeff's going to talk in a little bit more detail about that and the effect of that on the budget process. But if we look at just at expenses, again, we see a decrease in total expense from $174 million in the current year revised budget to the expected budget as of now, and this is obviously not a fixed number yet, we're still working on it, of about $172 million. So that's an overall decrease between years, which doesn't happen unless you make proactive choices in the budget process, which we've done, and we're working towards balancing that budget. So the net change here is right now based on the revenue growth of 2.2%. Now that's excluding the fund balance usage from last year, and comparing that with the 1.2% decrease in expenses. That leaves us with a gap because we had the fund balance usage this year that we're working with. That leaves us at a gap of $3.9 million, or about $4 million, which is about 2.3% of the total expense budget. So what that means is to get to balance now, before we look at any enhancements or any increases, or even adding back any items that departments pulled out of their budget to meet their target, we need to find some adjustments to accommodate $3.9 million to be balanced before we can look at considering any enhancement items or returning any items into the budgets that were taken out to meet their target. So that's what we're working with now. Again, the operating costs decreased by about $7 million. Capital outlay decreased about $1 million. $300,000 of that was through vehicle replacement. The total need to replace vehicles is about $300,000 less this year than it was last year, which is a great thing. And that's based on replacement cycle and the cost of vehicles and type of vehicles we replace this year. And again, right here, which is interfund transfers out, 1.6, that's what we have for PAYGO right now. That will very likely change based on decisions that you make around capital and capital planning. We're going to have a great presentation from Chris Boyd here in a little bit to talk about some of the capital needs. And that's where we are with expense. So right now, the budget gap is about $4 million that we're working to close. Do you have any thoughts or any questions on that? All right. Next steps, like I said, we're working on strategies to close the current budget gap of about 2.3%. We're going to do our best to distribute that between revenues and expenses so we can balance it in a conservative manner. Also, any adjustments that are made will be after the 2% reduction that departments have already taken for the most part to meet their expected target. And closing this gap doesn't include any enhancement requests or requests to bring back budget that was taken out by departments to meet that target reduction. Just to update you on one of the things that I've been doing last week, and I'm going to continue this week, is doing site visits with all of our volunteer fire departments. I've met with 5 or 6 so far and spent at least a couple hours with each of them. And it's been a great experience. It's been great to get out there and learn the community and get to know the fire chiefs and understand their needs and see their firehouses and see their equipment and how dedicated they are in serving the community. So I've been doing that and talking about their budgets and what their needs are and what they've been working with up to this point and what they need to keep them moving in a positive manner. So that's been a great experience for me and I've enjoyed that. We're going to be starting department budget meetings next week, and those will go through next week and the week after to meet with departments and go through their budget requests in detail and talk about their needs and requests. Other items for consideration, these are just a couple of the big pieces of the budget that decisions will be made around. Of course, I've been talking about the general fund budget, which is the county operations more or less. And then also is the capital improvement plan that Chris is going to talk about. The enterprise fund budget, of course, solid waste, public works, water, wastewater, the volunteer fire departments, outside agencies, community partners, and of course the school budget. Those are the big ticket items that are still on the calendar to make decisions around. This is our working budget calendar updated. I believe you saw this a month ago or so, and updated based on where we are in the process. And right now, this is where we are here. I've been meeting with the fire departments, and starting next week, we'll begin having discussions with departments in detail to share the requests with us. And then from there on, working down towards the manager's proposed presentation and the county manager's proposed budget document here at the end of, or in May. And that's all that I have for you. Are there any questions or thoughts or any follow-up? All right. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Blake. So next we are going to have a capital improvement plan preview from Chris Boyd. And Chris is going to really talk to you about a facility renewal strategy that he has worked to develop, and we've spent some time as staff talking about this over the last month, I guess. He has done a great amount of work and really looking to provide the board with a framework that we would like to utilize going forward in our budget process. You know, last year we talked about capital. I would say we spent most of the time though talking about what we would consider major capital projects. This considers major capital, but also what Chris is calling a facility renewal program and how we manage operationally the capital needs of the county. And so we're not asking for direction today, but this will be coming back to you. We would like feedback today so that whatever we put together in terms of our funding strategy would align well with what the board is looking for, but Chris is going to go through the process that he's followed to this point.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. Good afternoon, Commissioners. Appreciate the opportunity to share this information with you. I'm going to give you a break from the numbers. We're not going to talk about numbers today with the capital plan, so I'm just going to talk about the process and a strategy as we're moving forward with the capital plan. So facility renewal program, basically that can be drilled down to a capital improvement plan plus operating dollars that can be invested in facilities improvements, facilities repairs, but both fitting into the same framework and plan. And so I'll go through what our process has been so far this year to put that plan together. And first, one of the things I want to talk about is what our model is designed to accomplish. I'm sure everybody's heard the term deferred maintenance. You know, usually that's facilities deficiencies that over time are deferred, usually due to funding concerns or priorities, other high priorities within organizations. So one of our goals is to reduce our deferred maintenance backlog. Also, when we're reducing that deferred maintenance backlog, we also want to reduce the rate of growth of, or eliminate completely the rate of growth of deferred maintenance. In the end, that means when we start reducing that backlog, is it improves our FCI, which is a facility condition index, which is an industry standard key performance measure for, you know, what's the quality of your buildings, what are the conditions of your facilities. Our model should also support projects required for program improvements, also growth and space needs improvement projects, and I think more importantly is identify a consistent and sustainable level of investment that it's going to take to reach that. I think one of the most important things any of these plans can do is say This is the level of investment that an organization needs to make in order to accomplish some of these goals. So first of all, planning process, what did that look like this year? What's it going to look like next year? So first and foremost, you have to identify your maintenance, repair, renovation, and new facilities needs. I'll talk about each of these bullets in more detail as we're moving through, so I'll go quickly through those. Then document your projects. You know, after you identify those needs, document your projects. Then assign those projects priorities, assign them funding groups, and finally develop your CIP. So the first bullet was identify maintenance, repair, renovation, and new facilities needs. So in order to do that, and what we've done this year is use facility condition assessments. The county this year, we used internally generated facility condition assessments. So that meant staff in the field looking at condition of equipment, of buildings, of systems, of components. We do have a plan to engage an outside group to come in and help us with our next level facility condition assessment. Because one of the things with staff, you know, we're fairly limited in staff in the facility department. And so they're continuously working on service orders, work orders, those types of things. So trying to get an amount of time for them to go out and do facilities inspections is pretty difficult. Also, equipment life cycle and condition-based replacement plans. So, for instance, you've got a rooftop HVAC unit. Its life cycle is expected to be 15 years. So this plan basically fits that life cycle replacement into a year. Once you approach that coming year, say it's 2022, once you get closer to 2022 and 2020, then you make a condition-based assessment. So can we move that from 2022 to 2023 or 2024? So even though we put the initial project into its standard typical life cycle year, we still may extend that based on the actual condition of the equipment. Also, I met with every department, I think. I'm pretty confident of that. But I know I said that a couple times and then someone popped up and said, wait a minute, you didn't meet with me. And so that was to gain an understanding of what their space needs requests will be, any improvement projects that they wanted to accomplish in the coming year and or years, and then any space needs analysis that the county had previously done. I can name a few. You know, Board of Elections did a space needs analysis. Actually did space need analysis for Sheriff's Office and the Emergency Services Complex. And then if there are any master plans that are in place with the county, those can also be used to inform.
Now, we've got the Sheriff's Department and Emergency Services covered through the bond.
We do. We got those covered.
Board of Elections is the only one that we need to tackle now.
Well, I'm not going to say the only one, but it is one that is
Yes.
what I'll consider a
Next
high priority. And we'll talk about assigning priorities here in just a second. So the next step, once you've identified the needs, is to document your projects, right? So you start talking about scope and refining scope. Of course, there's always a starting place in capital planning, and that's your previous capital plan. And so some of the scopes may have changed. You know, you go meet with a department and they say, well, we're only going to plan to hire 3 new employees versus it was 6. Or they're going to, it usually goes up, right? Usually it's, they were going to hire 2, now they're going to hire 4. So you got to change scope. What happens when you change scope? Well, estimates change. So then you got to go through and adjust your estimates and reconcile your estimates. And of course, one of the most important parts is project justification. And so our first pass with facilities, and I guess validating projects is looking at that justification, make sure it reconciles with what their actual request is. So back to the point of they're asking for space for 6 new employees. Well, they're only going to hire 2, so now we need to potentially pull that estimate back and that scope back. So after documenting projects, then you start assigning priorities. And I want to make clear that when I'm talking about assigning priorities, this is from a facilities perspective. One of the things that I think is really important is to use a formula-based approach. And so this year we did use a formula-based approach that starts giving certain weight to different types of projects, and just give you a little indication of what that means. So safety projects, I mean, it's kind of a no-brainer, right? It gets, highest priority. Security, building envelope, operational requirements, space needs, public area finishes, and you can see all the way down to non-public area finishes and aesthetic projects. So, it makes a lot of sense, I hope, that an aesthetic-only project is not going to get a very high priority. And then also, other factors are what kind of overall concerns are addressed by the project. You get a sense how those are kind of weighted in this formula-based approach. So life safety health gets 100 points, security projects 80, business continuity 70, life cycle replacement 60, and on down the line. And you can kind of see where the different space needs, you can, if you've got a current space need, it's going to get 50. If it's 5 years down the road, then it's going to get 20. If it's 10 years down the road, it gets a 10.
Are these are these county, scoring points, is that a county-wide
It is a
procedure?
county-wide.
I'm talking about all the counties besides you.
Oh, no, not every county uses it. I mean, every county does it different. Every organization does this differently. But from my perspective, from my role as a facilities director, is to set, an initial priority ranking for the county manager's office and leadership team, who can then guide and direct their knowledge of the county priorities. We can make adjustments to the priorities based on that. And then finally, that getting back to the commissioners for consideration and adjustment of those priorities based on, what, the goals and objectives for the county for that year. And talked a little bit about that. So once the general priorities are put together, then reconciling general priorities with the non-county, back to the point of, you start this with a capital plan. And most of the time, that capital plan is not going to, change a lot. So some of those existing priorities are priorities for the coming year. And so we can make some adjustments, even though scoring may indicate that a project is a little lower than you would imagine. But based on the county's priorities, we can raise that some. And so then the final priorities, of course, set by the county manager and the commissioners. So then moving to what is kind of a new concept, I think, for the county. Not new in facilities management, but I think new for the county, is assigning funding groups. So we're looking at, this program looks at 3 major funding groups. First being operations capital. Those are projects typically less than $100,000. Some examples of those are small equipment repair, replacement, small office renovations, minor carpet, some painting, things like that. The next group is facilities repair renovation. Those are typically projects between 100 and 300, and back to the operation. So the capital policy for Union County basically sets 100,000 as the delineation of capital. It has to be 100,000 or more to qualify as a capital project. So that's one of the reasons why that $100,000 number is there. The next is facility repair and renovation project between 100 and 300. They're more major equipment types, things like control upgrades, whole building control upgrades. For instance, one of the projects, listed as a control upgrade for this building, we're still running off pneumatic controls in this facility, which is, I don't know too many facilities still running on pneumatic controls. But at any rate, that's...
Is it giving trouble?
No, it's not giving us a lot of trouble. But the problem with this is an interesting project. The problem is it's hard to find people that can work on it. And so there's not a lot of people that are trained, on pneumatic controls anymore. So we're lucky that we've got some institutional knowledge, some people that have been working on it for a while. But it's somewhat unreliable. So anytime you lose, an air compressor or the air compressor trips or any of that, then we end up with an issue with a control system. And then office suite renovations, you see, a small office renovation, for instance, if somebody wanted to go in and add some cubicles in a small office to split it up, that's a small project. But then if you want to do a larger office suite, then that's kind of usually will fit in that facility repair renovation. And then, of course, the next category is major capital, which are projects typically greater than $300,000. And everyone knows what the major capital projects are. Any new buildings, and then comprehensive renovations to facilities. Even sometimes larger roofs will fit in there. I know the sheriff's got a project for door locks that is a major capital project and fit in that bucket. And so we are calling them kind of buckets, these three funding groups. And to go a little bit further into that, so the operations capital. So the idea is that those smaller projects, we're looking to invest in each of the operations funds for facilities, parks, library, and sheriff, an annual level that's consistent with this plan. Moving over to facility repair and renovation, basically that's real capital dollars, that's general fund pay-go type projects. And again, at an annual level that's consistent with our overall plan. And then the major capital is usually debt funded. Some general pay-go, I think, you heard in the previous presentation that that's an undecided number, at this point. But certainly some general pay-go projects are there. Now that annual level is based on priorities, right? The county's priorities and debt capacity. If we're looking at debt-funded projects. So after signing those funding buckets and putting each of those projects into these buckets, you look to distribute these three groups over the 5-year period, evenly distributed. A little harder on the major capital, right? Because it's really based on priorities, the county's priorities and things, but it's easier with the operation capital and the facility repair and renovation to evenly distribute the need over that 5-year period.
Now, when you say evenly, you mean the same dollar amount for each category?
No, so each, the same dollar amount per year. So if you're looking at, I'll just throw out a number, $2 million total over 5 years is $400,000 a year. So you try to distribute that OC and FRR, operation capital and facility repair and renovation, equally over that, so that you can have a sustainable level of funding. So it just doesn't go like this every year. So you can more or less eliminate, some of your, some of
So
the
you would set
discussion.
major capital projects aside from that?
You do.
Okay.
You try, right? I mean, one of the things you do is you try to fit it into an even distribution, but it inevitably comes back to what are the priorities for the county on the major capital projects. A lot driven by debt capacity and ability to fund it with general fund pay-go type funds. So distribution based on general priorities, adjusted based on final priorities. The good part to this planning approach is that it's easily adapted to available funding. So if, you know, my recommendation for annual funding amount exceeds what our capacity is, we can adjust the plan. But what does that mean? Well, that means we're deferring. And back to the whole point of, you know, one of the goals to accomplish is to eliminate some of our deferred maintenance and facilities. And the good part to it, of course, is the annual investment requirement. You know, it informs the commission and the county manager of what the investment level should be to accomplish those goals in the capital plan. So with that, any questions? And this was really a chance to get, you know, this concept in front of you before we start, you know, applying numbers to it. And we've done a lot of work over the past year, you know, putting the projects together, and reconciling the projects, verifying the projects, and doing all the prioritization, the general prioritization.
When will we get a glimpse at those projects in the three categories?
Sometime in April.
Yeah,
We haven't set the
so.
schedule yet, but
Yeah.
Yeah, we already have an amount budgeted for them this year.
no, we have 1.6 million, I think, in our planning
That was the starting point.
numbers, but it's gonna be different than that, I can tell you, based on the work we've done over the last couple of weeks looking at it. I don't know what the number is yet, but it'll be different than
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, so one of the things that from my perspective is that, okay, so we identify the need, the overall need, and we present that to the manager and leadership. And based on funding, we start making adjustments, or based on investment opportunities, and we start adjusting the plan. And we're in the part, we're
Right.
kind of in that part.
So we've gone through this a couple of times with Chris, looking at it in different ways, and then what we've done is kind of sent staff back to look at what are all the available funding streams that we've had out there that have been allocated differently because we haven't had a process like this in the past that we could tap into to address this need. So that's really where we are now and how that fits into the recommendation. But we wanted to know, you know, if we're way off base, we think this is a good, strong, sustainable approach, but this is different than what we've done, but I think different in a positive way. And then we'll come back to you with the funding strategy of how we get there, and you can see the projects and kind of where the line's drawn over that 5-year period.
I did have a question back
It's
from,
a long list, so if you, I mean, I've got one with me, it is,
I did have a question on business continuity. Would you give me a couple examples? I mean, everything else in here is on that rating them, I pretty much understand. But give me an example, one or two examples of business continuity.
Well, for instance, this building, you know, in order for the county to maintain its business operations, this building has to be functional, right? So replacing the generator on this building would accomplish
Stuff
security.
that makes sure we're able to operate each day.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, historically, I've seen deferred maintenance is more costly maintenance.
It absolutely is.
It costs you more in the long run if you get your plan working. And I think it may take you a couple years to reap your benefits,
Yeah.
but it will benefit you long term.
It's the same argument for preventive maintenance, right? And so if you invest in preventive maintenance, over time, you know, the amount of calls that you get, you know, from, you know, chillers down, HVAC system's not working, leaks here, leaks there. It's the same concept that you eliminate, it may be a little, and I'll call it painful, right? You know, to go to that preventive maintenance approach and to this funding level, but in the long run, you end up being a proactive institution or organization versus the other.
I agree.
All right, any other questions? Okay.
Our last item, Jeff will come back and he is going to go over a debt redemption strategy with you. This is a strategy to reduce our debt service, and this is also an overview of an item that will be on next week's agenda for action by the board. So Jeff will go through that in further detail.
All right, thank you. Okay, so good news. We talked, I think our first 3 discussions were looking like we're going to be short a little bit at the end of this year. Blake's discussion that we're a little bit out of balance in the operating fund, and then Chris's discussion how we need some capital funds. So I'm going to talk a little bit about today, to wrap it up, about a way that we can put some money back into the coffers to work with all these issues. So with that in mind, you know, we talk a lot about our debt and kind of what that looks like. Well, my staff and I, and Beverly Lyles in our office, and Jared White who's here from our FA, we are constantly working at our debt portfolio to figure out, okay, are there ways that we can change it, early redemption, refundings, strategies that we can implement to try to generate savings on an annual basis. And the way that we look at it is the savings in the debt portfolio have zero impact on operations, with the except to say that that helps us add back resources to try to cover operational costs. So if we reduce our debt service, for instance, then by $1 million, that gives us $1 million of revenue, of current revenue, or ad valorem dollars, or whatever the source of that is, then to go back to operations. So we're always looking for ways to kind of sharpen our pencil. And you've seen this, those of you that have been on the board for a while have seen us do this several times over the last 5, 6, 7 years to try to reap some savings, and just by simple things like paying early, paying, you know, our refunding or changing the way we pay. So with that, I want to talk about one of those opportunities that we've kind of identified in the last few months is going to be redeeming early some of our debt that pays off next year. I want to look at a smoothing strategy and the estimated savings of doing that, and then talk about that, how we're going to fund that, or how we would ask or suggest that you fund that. So I just want to remind you, we talked a little bit already this year in the budgetary process. This is what your outstanding debt portfolio looks like. This hasn't changed since the last time we were here. This is broken down by type of debt and then by type of function. You see the education debt. This would include SPCC and UCPS. So that's why that number of 344, and you have, of course, this column is approved, unissued. And if you remember, we have several issues coming up. We're getting ready to go to market to issue the debt for the water and sewer. That'll be in the May time frame. We also have coming up, we're going to issue the remainder of this GO debt. That's the library, the SPCC, and a small bit remaining on the schools. And then we'll also issue the 911 facility and the sheriff's office renovation. So that'll empty the cupboard, if you will, on your approved but unissued debt. And that GO issue will come sometime in the summer, July. And if you remember what's not on here, which has been already approved, is the funding that you approved to build or to purchase the industrial park and build the pump station, about $21 million for that. So with that in mind, when we started looking at our debt service schedule, we realized that quickly that we had quite a few maturities coming due in 2020, I'm sorry. So what we can do with that is allows us to go ahead and pay that early. So we have the ability to redeem, what's referred to as redeem, about $9 million of outstanding education-related debt. Pay that off now. And that would be about $1.5 million from 1999, which funded gyms at the older high schools and new elementary school classrooms, and then almost $7.6 million in from 2005 bonds, which have since been refunded a couple of times. Both of these have been refunded. And that money was used to build the Kensington Elementary, Sandy Ridge, Porter Ridge Middle and High. So these are existing issues that are now starting to come to maturity. So when we look at it, and the blue bars are kind of what your scheduled debt service would be, or at this point, what we can see is we would normally pay down this debt service each year as it goes year over year. What we're suggesting is that we can achieve a savings if we come in and pay off about $9 million and make that payment before the end of the year, we can achieve a budgetary savings of about $7.7 million. And a true cash savings, because of foregone interest, of about $300,000, about $298,000 and change. So what this is akin to is if you're paying your mortgage and you got down to the end and you had that last month and you went ahead and paid it a month early, you're going to save interest, but you're also going to go ahead and just have that payment knocked out. So your next month you'd have more money in your bank account, right? So what we're recommending is we go ahead and do that redemption. I want to point out that this is a smoothing strategy. So what we would do is come in and lock in over the next few years the debt service at that $32.7 million rate, or dollar value. And this would require us to budget in 21 and 22 a little bit to help offset those costs. But as you can see, it stair steps down. And this is no different than the strategy we're using on our GO debt. That the new GO debt that we have for the public safety that we talked about, pretty much all of the issues here are in a smooth strategy so that you don't have to keep changing your debt tax rate and so forth. I will point out that what we're talking about today, and this all comes out of, there's my dot, there it is, all comes out of the general fund. And if you remember that all the historical debt that was issued before about 2014, I believe, was paid, all that debt service was paid out of general fund. And as that debt came on, general fund services were cut, or ad valorem tax growth was used to cover that debt service at that time. But now the Commission's policy is that when you bring on new debt, for instance, when we bring on the new parts of this that are GO, they'll be placed in the debt sinking fund, not in the general fund. So there's a committed tax rate to cover that debt. So what we're talking about is old debt then that came out of operations on the county side. So with that, how would we fund it? Because you have to make that payment. It's not free, so we need about $9 million to redeem it. We have several sources available to us. When we did our last issue, the county issued what's referred to as a premium, meaning that the bond buyers paid us more than the face value or the value of those bonds to receive our debt and be able to reap interest off of that. We had that to the tune of about $4 million. So we issued $50 million of debt. The county received $54 million of proceeds. The trick is that, however, that $4 million premium payment, or proceeds from that premium, can only be used on voter-approved GO bond projects. In addition, when we took in that $54 million, that was invested, and Beverly does our investments, and we were able to generate an estimated $1.8 million of earned interest on those bond proceeds. Both of those dollar values, that $5.8 million, can only be used on GO bond election projects. So coming back then, if you remember, we had the Sun Valley High School project. Schools came back and requested that an additional, I believe it was right around $6.5 million, be funded as PAYGO funding in that school, in that Sun Valley High School project. And you remember that Sun Valley High School is one of our bond projects. So what we are suggesting is that we take that $5.8 million of restricted revenue that can only be spent on the bond project and swap out the source of funding. So that $5.8 million of cash will become available to the county for debt refunding. Okay? So we've taken that restricted money, put it to a proper project, bring back the cash, and then add about $3.3 million. Remember our slide earlier, we have about $4.4 million projected fund balance available. Use about $3.3 million of that with the 5.8 to generate that $9.1 million redemption payment. Okay? So the idea being then to go ahead and make that $9.1 million debt payment redemption around the 1st of May. Now this is a timing payment, a timing play, so it allows us to go ahead and reap the benefit into the next year. The true savings on that is about $30,000 a month between here and whatever that final maturity would have been. So that savings is about $298,000, $299,000 in real savings to the county. But the benefit is that next year to take care of these needs we're talking about, capital, additional services needed, balancing the budget and so forth, that would free up $7.7 million for next year's budget process for 2021. I'm sorry, for 2020. And if you remember right now, Blake showed you that he had about $40.5 million in debt service plugged in. So that's our current budget, our current estimate in our debt service. So this would take that number down to about 32.7 million. So with that, kind of what the next steps, and as Michelle alluded, this will actually be on your agenda for next Monday night. What we're asking is that the board appropriate the $5 million of bond premium proceeds and interest to the Sun Valley High School project and reduce that PAYGO funding by 5.8. I will point out, to be real clear, zero impact to the project for the schools. No more money, no less money, just a change in the sources of funds that are coming from the county. Recognizing that the schools can't issue debt and they don't control the funding sources for their projects. We then will take that PAYGO funding and appropriate $5.8 million with $3.4 million of GO from the general operating fund balance to pay 3 of the outstanding bonds early. So we'll go through the redemption process. Scott Leo, our bond counsel, has already drafted our redemption notices, so as soon as you give us the okay, the next day, will be April 2nd, we'll go ahead and issue those redemption notices for May 2nd because there's a 30-day redemption requirement. So we'll go ahead and issue those. And then the last step in your process would be to authorize me as a financial services administrator to take the additional steps necessary and notices necessary to redeem those. So once you approve that action Monday evening, it's all in one action, then we'll be able to go ahead and make that happen. With that net result being about a $7.7 million savings in next year's budget process. So with that in mind, I know I kind of went through it, and it's a little complicated, but I'd be happy to answer any questions or try to clarify any points if you have any questions.
I want to congratulate y'all. It took me a couple of days and I called you back this morning. This is very impressive, and I appreciate what finance has done. And it's just another reason I'm proud to live in Union County.
Logical.
Yeah, I'm always about paying off debt early. That's a good thing.
Frank's not holding it, so he'll be okay.
Would it save any money to act on it before next Monday?
It would be very little, if any, and I think
Now,
that...
very little when you deal with millions is...
Jared, do you remember what the date?
I don't remember the exact number. It is I want to say a couple $1,000s a day.
So Jared's RFA, so he does a lot of these calculations for us and calculates the interest on a daily basis.
That's still a couple $1,000.
Obviously, the pleasure of the board, we can...
Would it mess anything up?
Jeff, do you see any issue?
Yeah, he's noticed.
Notice or anything with...
Board can recess this meeting.
Can they take action today? Is there anything?
We put in there to take such action.
So,
Was that a yes or a no?
The question is whether or not the board can take action on this at a recessed meeting.
all right, today, right now, if they wanted to take an action right now to move ahead and adopt and approve this item that's supposed to be on the agenda for Monday night, would they be able to do that now? Or is there a reason with the notices and so forth that we couldn't do that?
Let me take a look at the notice that we posted for this meeting. It was posted as work session with the ability to take action. I just want to make sure it's broad enough that will be inclusive. You don't want any issues with your notice on an action of that magnitude.
So like
5 minutes.
5 minutes?
Yeah, 5-minute recess.
$5,000.
Okay, we'll reconvene.
Yes. Okay, are we ready? Perfect. So what you have in front of you, as we kind of laid out the steps, the question we had was, can we go ahead and do it today? We talked with Jeff Pruitt, our legal team, and our financial advisor and so forth. Yes, we can do it. Our estimate is, they'll say about 7 million, give or take. I'm sorry, 7,000, 7 million. So what we provided for you, as we had talked earlier, this was originally planned to be on Monday night's agenda. We have for you the agenda item in the draft agenda. The motion that we're asking for is to authorize the Financial Services Administrator to proceed with the early redemption of the 3/1/2020 bond maturity for the 2004A, 2009A, and 2009B GO bonds, and to adopt CPO 225 and budget amendment number 35. So that's the agenda item you have in front of you that lays out all the information we laid out for you today. And then as attachments to that, you have the CPO, which affects the budget, or the capital funding, and the budget amendment, which also then appropriates the money from the budgetary side, the operating budget side, to be able to make those early redemption payments. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions or clarify anything you need.
Typo, 2004B.
I'm sorry, yes it is. 2004A. Right?
The A's have,
It's the 04Bs, 09As, 09Bs.
So this
That's
is the
right,
typo.
so that's incorrect.
So this is incorrect. It's
The
the
motion was
the
incorrect.
motion should be the 2004B, 2009A, and 2009B. So this is correct. Sorry, Commissioner. Thank you for asking that.
Problem.
Sharp eyes. So moved.
Got a motion?
Don't ask me.
Okay.
That is a
Any
motion.
I take it as a motion. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Well, thank you. That's
Yes,
unexpected.
well,
We
yes.
appreciate it.
And that's all we have today.
Even better.
Thank you.
All right. I appreciate everyone's support, and I move to adjourn the special meeting.
Aye.